Oh, Sierra's
Okay, we are going live now on YouTube. Okay.
Welcome back. My name is Sierra Peters, and I'm excited to welcome you to
Okay, we are going live now on YouTube.
Okay. Okay, now we're live. Thank you all for coming. I'm excited to welcome you back to At the Wave's Edges, a cross-generational dialogue on Black feminisms. And we're just gonna jump right in. So okay, we're good now. Thank you so much to our BCA staff person who is doing all of our tech and has been doing all our tech this entire time. So I guess I'll first say thank you to Andrew and everyone at the BCA for hosting our conversation today, as they have been for the past 3 months as part of our year-long exhibition about the Combahee River Collective and its impact on Boston history and Black feminisms very broadly. My name is Sierra Peters, and I'm excited to be in conversation today with Demita Frazier, Jen Mergel, and Ariel Gray. I'm just going to read a little bit about the program, and then we're going to get started. At the confluence of Combahee, history was made. Yet long since forming the namesake radical socialist Black feminist Combahee River Collective in Boston in 1974 and co-publishing the landmark statement, the Combahee River Collective Statement, in 1977, co-collective founder Demita Frazier remains with eyes forward, and basic justice remains elusive, and capitalism's chokehold tightens. And the academic echo chambers are not yet talking to crowds in the public sphere. So Demita has lovingly joined us today to seek dialogue and fresh debate across generations around the promise and pitfalls facing Black feminism today. Rather than crystallize the collective's past, Frazier harnesses her hindsight to critically explore present challenges and those ahead. So this is the second part of our two-part series, as I stated before. And so I guess I'm just going to welcome Demita.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah.
And Ariel will be joining us a little bit later.
Wonderful.
So I guess to get us started, maybe we should just do like a mini recap. So at the end of our last session, we had talked a little bit about, commodification in Black feminism. We had also talked about, I guess, where we had ended, in our deeply probative conversation, were some of the issues surrounding, our context in creating this project, perhaps not issues, but, the pandemic was a huge part of our conversation, and, the effects of state-sanctioned violence, I'm going to call it, on poor working class people, particularly people of color in the United States. We had talked about coalition building. We talked about class. And so I think where we left off was we were talking about disruption, creative disruption, and that was kind of where we ended. I think the last question was something like, do you believe, what was it? Oh, I'm so bad at this. It was something adjacent to, can we be with people that disagree with us, or can we be like, how are we, when we are in company of people who don't exactly align with our political values, how do we continue to be together? Is that something that's possible for us, I guess, individually? I think Demita, you had talked about being like someone that like always believes that if we can do something, even just a little bit of work that's like radical and transformative, then you're down to do it. And I think that I said that like in I think I said something like, in my organizing practice, and in my wider lens, I try to be as empathetic and big tent as possible. But in my personal life, that's not always true for me. So I don't know, Jen, you didn't answer the question last time. So I don't know like where we want to start this, or like how we should pick up. How should we enter this conversation? I think I said that last time. How do we enter this conversation today?
Well, and we were talking about the potential for productive disruption. And also, Demita, you had a notion about conflict sometime being essential to really move forward. One of the things I was hoping to ask you, Demita, is when we had initially talked about this project back in 2019, you had talked about the necessity of bringing people into a physical room together and to be able to have conversations together where sometimes, you know, you could even feel the tension in the room, but that could be a productive catharsis or break, and sometimes lead to breakthroughs that are hard to do on screen in this sort of Zoom space, which is why, you know, we had to transition this project online because of the pandemic. But I'm really interested, because you've done a lot of institutional work, organizational, structural work, to hear a little bit about your perspective, having done a lot at Tufts, you know, teaching within organizations. What you've seen has been productive when it comes to conflict and catharsis, and then if it is resolution or if it is productive break, you know, what happens from there?
Well, let's just slow the whole train down and go back for a second, because in fact, conflict, I'm not sure how you phrased it a minute ago, but conflict is always present when any number of people more than one are in a room. Okay, so it's always a possibility just because the humans. Number two, I think it's important to realize that anytime you attempt to make change or transformation, by necessity, conflict has to come into play, because when you start using words like transformation and revolution, and you begin to talk about a subject in ways that heighten people's sense of passion, people's sense of readiness or lack thereof. These are big. So I think it's important to remember or notice, and I've always noticed this, conflict is always going to be there. The issue is how you're going to cope with it and deal with it. How are you going to make it? I love the phrase generative conflict. Thank you so much, Sierra. It is absolutely the way to look at conflict, since we know it's inevitable. And knowing that, in anticipation of organizing in groups, it's worth it to sort of think about, as we often do not, because I never knew any of this until I knew it intuitively and I felt it and I couldn't always articulate it. But in every organization I've been a part of since I'm a teenager, I've always been, you know, picking apart and noticing conflict. Some will say it's my Virgo rising. Others will simply say I'm one of those hypervigilant people. But the truth of the matter is, watching human interactions and then watching how they delimit, are neutral, or expand the possibilities of communication, and then how we work together has been fascinating to me. So we do not do it well. We typically, Audre Lorde said something once in one of our meetings that was really funny, because she's right. In the same way we deal with difference, which we either try to become it, kill it, or ignore it. I mean, we think those are our only choices. And in fact, there's more to the possibilities, but again, the humans and how we struggle. So I think what I'd like to say is, what I notice is now when I work with groups, I really try to talk from the very beginning about the things that will ultimately cause your organization to stultify or fail. And one is not paying attention to conflict and nurturing, I love that, generative conflict, as opposed to the kinds of conflict that we're typically used to dealing with. And don't forget, when you're in an organization, you're dealing with the way in which you, as an individual, deal with relationships, capital R. And the working political relationship gets very tangled up with lots of things. I mean, we won't even have to go into the ways in which sex, which I think should be forgiven, but it never is when you're talking about people working together in political groups. I think when you're talking also about understanding power, because that's at the root of, I think, most of it, is understanding how when you're in in relationship with someone in an organization, there is the continual struggle to come to grips with, okay, how do we share power? What does power mean to me? How do I feel about being in the role of leader? Because let me also say, there are no leaderless organizations. there are organizations in which people step in and out of the role of leader because we're humans and we're still barely off the planes. So we really have to have someone willing to be in that role, but it doesn't have to be just one person. And we have to also create the capacity for all members to be able to take over if something goes wrong. Mm-hmm. So when I say goes wrong, you know what I mean, in case there's a need to substitute someone. So I guess what I will finally say is I have seen people who have tried to get organizations to confront and deal with the kinds of conflict, and especially conflict that relates to race, color within an organization of Black women, or relating to socioeconomic class, or what we used to call educational privilege amongst us in groups of Black women. And I have to say, we were not what I would describe as successful. The subject would surface, we would talk about it, but we didn't necessarily arrive at decisions. And because we were socialist feminists, we also knew that we had, as a fallback, the ability to talk about materiality and the entire role of what it means to be in a power relationship, blah, 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 blah. But it wasn't as if we were able to, as Black feminists, necessarily articulate from our most human and vulnerable selves why it was deeply important to address class, why it was profoundly important for us to address colorism. We did, and by the way, colorism was no problem. It wasn't an issue. We did have a woman who came to the group, though, who had been raised in a very upper class family on the Upper East Side of New York, and felt herself to be Black, even though she was white, because all the servants and all the people who raised her were Black people. And so, and I'm laughing because I'm thinking about how often in America, that's only possible here with Rachel Dolezal and all that. But we actually, in that, this is kind of laughing now, but in fact, it brought up an issue that I think I see resurging now in popular culture, especially Black popular culture, around light-skinnedness and around who's actually Black and what does that actually mean? And the reflections that for those of us who are dark brown, which I can't believe we're even still talking about this in the same way because I thought it was resolved, but obviously not, I missed some things. The idea that still blondness, whiteness is currency. And it's currency in popular culture in a way that is like, wow, right? And I really wonder, I observe it and know so deeply in my own self what it's like as you try to negotiate public face, so representative face to the world, and then behind the curtain, all the different pieces of who you really are that can never really be shown. I mean, it's interesting to me, people show X, but there's so many there's so many compartments and slices, and I don't know, the words can't come right now, but the idea that someone's identity is simply 1, 2, or 3 things, I've never bought that. So the idea that representation is critical, it is, except that it's always lacking. Because to be truly bare and show the complex gumbo that is who you are, that's ill-advised in this society.
Well, and it makes me think it's also 2 ways. So as much as you may struggle to communicate all of the aspects and facets of oneself, you also need there to be somebody who is curious, who is open and receptive to all of those facets. And if there's not a curiosity, if there's not a receptivity, why would you expend the energy? Why would you expend the effort to then assert that? I loved it. Again, I have to thank Sierra and Ari and you, Demita, for sharing so much knowledge with me. But in the latest project for Combahee's Radical Call, our Mother's Gardens, Sierra developed a beautiful virtual reading room with over 100 links to all of these phenomenal texts, live interviews, performances, film clips, related to this universe, this whole constellation of Black feminist thought from like Claudia Jones in the 40s forward.
Right.
And, you know, that introduction to the namesake for the project, Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens,
yes,
talks about these multiple definitions of womanist, not just one, right? And it's such a signal that there is the idea of a singular definition, singular categorization. We all defy that, but of course, in her beautiful literary way, she's demonstrating it over and over and over again. And if you aren't looking for that complexity, you're not going to find it, right? Like your colleagues are not going to find it, organizations are not going to find it, institutions are not going to find it.
Right. I have another thing also. I'm so sorry that Ari isn't here because she's the one who wrote that piece that she posted on Facebook. And I know you probably saw it, Sierra, but the piece that she posted on Facebook about dealing with conflict and how important it is. I mean, and it is for me. First of all, I thought it was wonderful that she did that because someone should post that once a day somewhere. It is an ongoing issue, and there's a lack of clarity for what's required to create respectful communication so that people can actually be vulnerable, be open, and be there. And see, I come from a half Southern culture that isn't always kind to people. It's a very natural thing to snap on someone who says or does something not too bright. See, listen to me. And so, I mean, it's that way of performing as a way of communicating. It's an issue of popular culture that I'm troubled by because I'm not trying to be, that's why cancel culture is a stereotype made up by assholes, but cancel culture is also real as fuck. Pardon my language, people. It's real because we've seen it happen. I remember back in the 70s, when people would have beef with one another, there was no internet. So they'd write these damning essays and these screeds that would go back and forth in women's newspapers. And half the time, there were those of us who were like, you need to go onto the playground, have a dust up and fight and get over yourselves. Fight and agree to disagree and move along. And character assassination, all kinds of behavior. And let's bring it down to, again, not everyone is interested in building coalitions across difference. So, for example, and you cannot assume that because an organization is peopled by people who represent extreme minorities and very small groups, you will not necessarily get quarter there either. In Chicago Gay Liberation, apropos of where we are today, in 1970, women, particularly Black, white, and Latina women, had to break off from Chicago Gay Liberation and become Chicago Lesbian Liberation because of the extreme misogyny and woman hatred and racism of the white men, the white gay men in the organization. They did not want to deal with racism. And I'll tell you a short story. The first meeting I went to, the first and only meeting I went to, I had newly returned to Chicago in 1971. I go to this meeting thinking, yes, we're going to do some work with the brothers and all us gay people together. We came in, 2 Black women sat down, 2 white gay men sitting to our left, and they didn't even say hello. One turned to us and said, do you know what bleeds for 5 days and doesn't die? Yeah. See, people were bold before the internet. Just want to point that out. And I was dumbfounded. I was like 21, and I remember I was just like, what? And so my point is, quickly I knew exactly what was going on. It wasn't like that was new. But it really began to point out to me that simply you can't assume anything about someone's politics because you share an aspect of your identity with them. And I think what really became clear at that point was recognizing that, in fact, when you begin looking at the broad array that makes up what we think of as the queer community right now, some of the things that we're dealing with as a larger community, we want to gloss over and pretend like it's all fine. But in fact, we're constantly pushing conflict away in the interest of building power. and not look, when I say building power, I mean uniting with our arms together against what we think of as an oppressive enemy. Not paying attention to the need to mind our own yard, to mind our own garden, and pay attention to the conflicts that are embedded. And that includes the ongoing misogyny that I see. And this is an interesting conversation I'm having with one of my trans men friends about the issue of misogyny in the trans men's community. And just confronting people having to deal with, if you're talking about new men, how new are you? What makes you new? Because no, you can't be abusive and be new. So, there's just a lot going on that it's hard to parse. Also living in this cauldron, it's hard for us to deal with our internal conflicts because the external pressures are so daunting sometimes. We want to appear as a formed body. We don't want to appear porous in any way. We want our substructure to look firm and without all, and that's not how we are. So it's just really challenging to figure out, again, generative conflict, how to deal from a place of generative conflict. And interrogating our own relationship to the power relationships within our organizations. Because I know that's another thing that we also shy away from. I know it was a struggle in every organization I've been a part of since I've been a young woman. I'm obsessed with power. I have to admit that the whole idea of understanding it, how you wield it well, how, what does it mean, blah, blah, blah. And so can't help but noticing it's not our forte as people.
That's so interesting that you say that. I think my experience, just speaking to what you were just commenting on, of the queer community, especially in the past 3 or 4 years of me very deeply and intentionally ingratiating myself with people who, again, politically aligned, right? Politically aligned people who are aligned with my values, emotionally aligned. I have only experienced, and I think I might have said this last time, or maybe just in conversation with y'all, I have only experienced people that are deeply involved and committed to their communities, who, and again, that's not to say, because people call other people out all the time, that's misogynistic, and have the grace to teach other people. I know that I have experienced a ton of grace from other folks in my community, as I was a baby queer, coming up and talking to people and learning. And I think even a lot of my first scholarly text, I think the first scholarly text I ever read was on my own, not a school book or anything like that, was the Afro-Latina reader, and it was this essay about this Dominican person going to the Dominican Republic and experiencing queer Dominican life, and me sharing that with my friend who was just I know this book, here it is, having this whole conversation. So I just say to say that how I enter this is actually from a space of not experiencing that, and it's and I do that purposely to protect myself, right? I I know what you're talking about when you say how people react to things, especially this American affect, or even, it's not even honestly American. Everybody everywhere has the capacity to be rude and to say things and just be straight shooters and all that. And I'm really lucky that I have cultivated relationships where I don't have to experience that, right? But all that comes from a place of pain, and trauma, and people really needing to deal with and heal from their wounds and tend to them, to use the language that we're talking about here today. And that being, I think for me, the place where conflict can go from generativeness to being, the other thing. Just conflict, right? Is whether or not we have dealt with some of those things by ourselves internally first, so that way we know that it's not a slight on us or our ideas or who we are as people, but the thing that we're building. And for me, I guess, again, for the people that I know, truly wanting and building something that is about community has been, and not about ourselves. It's not oh, this is my idea and my idea is good and da 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 da, but rather what's best for the people that we claim to serve. And so I think, I know a ton of like amazing queer and trans like people that have been doing like mutual aid organizing, for the past like for years and years. And just like living in the lineage of all those people, all those fugitive maroon societies that you had mentioned last time, all those Black philanthropists that you were talking about last time, people doing that, iterating on it, raising funds and just doing amazing, beautiful work. I have everywhere from Boston with Pride Extended to, South America, people who have connections being like, what, the dollar goes a lot further. You guys need to be spending some money. Y'all pay taxes. Like, how about you pay some money so that way we can make sure that these people can have access to the things that they need. Very basically, very basic, material goods. And so, I don't know. I guess like that's where I am at, but I will say like I am very intentional about who I spend my time with, and which like for better and for worse, right? Because like perhaps I'm foreclosing myself from some opportunity to have other experiences, but it's truly a protective measure, right? Like if we, especially like as Black people in the United States, like who you spend your time with and how those relationships, whether it's like at an organizational level or just like a peer-to-peer level, which is like what I'm talking about right now, just like people that I'm friends with. It's so important because you can really be harmed, from the workplace to any other place.
I got to tell you, it's kind of funny you said that you can be harmed. No joke. That's not even funny. And because the thing too, I'll tell you though, one of the great things about getting older is I can tell you, it will not kill you. White people's nonsense will not kill you. It really won't. You're just gonna get mad. It's not gonna kill you. Look at me. And I'm telling you, more than 50 years of dealing with nonsense, it will not kill you. You have to make an affirmative decision to your life. And you may have to, the thing about toughening your soul is that always being open to the possibilities of meeting like travelers. As a friend of mine who said she would never, ever, ever be with a white woman and who was with a white woman for 14 years, never say never. And I'm not saying that to say I'm just saying when we think about our lives, I'm thrilled, by the way, that you found, I'm just gonna say, when you think about our lives go in phases. And right now, it's funny, the thing that you feel about making sure you have a strong kernel of a community, everybody does that. We've always done that. But then the question becomes, for me, as I'm thinking about where y'all are right now versus 40, 50 years ago, is I'm writing about this. I have to keep putting myself back in time to remember what made it possible for us to organize the way that we did, to the extent that we did. And there were different pressures and different possibilities that obtained at that time that don't exist now, just as the opposite is true, because there are things and ways in which y'all are able to just create so much power and beauty right now because of the ways in which you have contact with one another. And that is the usefulness of where we are with media and the usefulness of where we are with the internet and all the
messaging. Messaging.
Right, messaging, thank you. And also connectivity, the capacity to be worldwide connected, even if that's not always a great connection. But I want to say one more thing that you said was so awesome. Okay, so here's my thing. There was something that, do you know who Robin D.G. Kelly is?
Oh, I love Robin D.G. Kelly.
I'm in love, I can't tell you. And he's married to somebody I'm in love with too. He's married to Lisa Gay, the actor. Do you know who she is?
No, wait, what was she in?
Lisa Gay Hamilton. You need to go on, just to look her up real quick on IMDb.
I don't know actors. I'm really bad with people.
Doesn't matter. People. She's fantastic. And the point is, he's brilliant, as you know. And Jen, are you familiar with his work?
I was looking up Lisa Gay Hamilton on IMDb to drop it in the Zoom chat.
Thank you.
So that people can see it.
Yeah.
Love that. Here's the thing about him. Here's something that he said. He was being interviewed. And I paraphrased what he said to ask a question of us. So here's my question for us. How do Black feminists, particularly in the New World, define the notion of liberation? And what strategies have we developed to achieve it? And I was set back on my heels at that question. Because the other day I was saying my usual mantra these days is, Black feminism didn't take. What happened? Black feminism. And so when I think about liberation struggles, because that's the only reason I'm doing this. I'm not doing this for my looks. I'm not doing it to be cute. This is really the work that we're doing, we take seriously, and we're doing it for the point of liberation. So, and he also says, liberation struggles are the following: varied, continual, and fraught with conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And generative conflict, you should really copyright that. I hope it's yours. Okay, and just, you think I'm joking. You're gonna find somebody using it to get a PhD. So in any event, I think the thing that he says though about clashing interests and how those are the things that often give us opportunities for generative conflict, but we shy away from them. So it's social economic class, colorism, homophobia, transphobia, all the phobias within our organizations. And I think, again, the struggle, the toggling between liberation for all and my liberation, my personal liberation, because I think, again, when we talked about it and when we articulated this idea of identity politics, it was for the sole purpose of strengthening ourselves so that we could be strong contributors to the liberation of our communities. That was why, not so we could be cute, not so we could, none of that. It was so we could create the space to create ourselves so that we could then be in our right, we were already in our rightful place. Because you see, the thing is, it's never been that Black women have not been at the center of liberation of our people in the New World, ever. From the moment we got, on the boats, everything. It's just the back and forth of dealing with patriarchy and dealing with misogyny and dealing with heteropatriarchy and all the other forces that mitigate against women's power. That's truly what we've been struggling with. And as we struggle to try to figure out as people, what do we want living in this cauldron? Do we want to really be like them? I don't think so. I don't think white supremacy is real. And I don't think trying to achieve what they have is a worthwhile pursuit.
Mm-hmm.
And the struggles to figure out how do we configure lives, how do we configure and visualize lives inside this is just daunting. I mean, I feel humbled by it every day because it's that struggle every day to figure out what's authentically mine, what's authentically ours, what can we create that we can keep? Because that's the other thing, is that losing control of the narrative, the commodification of Black feminism was only possible because we did not have control over our product under capitalism, honestly. So
when you say white supremacy isn't real, can you just contextualize that for me?
Yes. See, okay, we know that it's operative. We know that it is a controlling feature of of this entire collective new world. We know that it actually has active participants. We also know that, in fact, if you really think about whether they're actually superior, they're not. And I have to my father did a lot of crazy things, okay? Some of it was crazy. The most brilliant thing my father ever gave me was that gift of saying to me, they're going to try to tell you that they're superior. And I'm just going to tell you now, it's not true. The way he said it, the intonation, I'll never forget it. And it just went inside me. And I began comparing what I saw to what he said. And he was absolutely right. White folks were venal in terms of their dominant culture and the way they dominated into society. They were irrational. They told lies, like bold-faced lies. I mean, you just objectively as a kid, I would look at things and think, right, how did they do that? How did this happen? Which made me a historian when I was 8. So my point really is, I actually, and I had to keep it quiet for a while. See, I love darkness and dark skin and darkness. To me, that is the most beautiful. So I had to learn how to like, not darkness. My mother got me a Chatty Cathy. My sister and I got Barbies. And I did anatomical experiments on my Barbie. I was not interested in playing with Barbie. I cut all her hair off and I changed her parts around and did all kinds of things. The believing in the beauty of the female form, the white gaze, if you really start thinking about that, white supremacy is actually an illusion. It is operative, but that's an illusion makes you think it's real, when in fact, it really isn't. It's predicated upon a lie. And it's not the first thing that humanity's investigating that's been predicated on questionable evidence. Do I need to say more?
Well, I think what you're saying reminds me of something that Saidiya Hartman said one time. Fact is simply fiction endorsed by state power.
Yes, 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 yes. And I read something earlier today that there are all these indicators that can tell you how inferior or how illusory it is. That actual white people think that if the situations were reversed and we as African Americans took their place in the power dynamic and they became us, that we would do to them what they did to us, because, you know, aren't they the rule of thumb against which all others are measured? It's like, really, that wouldn't be the first thought I would have.
Yeah. Fear of a Black Planet. Isn't that what all these films are about?
Exactly. Fear of a Black Planet. Yes. Yeah, of course. And of course, what's really at the bottom of that fundamentally is knowing deeply that that's not true. And that is so disturbing to the white supremacist ideology, because it really does mean there's a lack of superiority. Like, I'm not studying you, and if things were reversed tomorrow, it's like, you need a lot of help. So I think we probably figured out some things for y'all to do while we took care of, you know, evolution.
Yeah.
But I also want to say, I had a conversation with someone, an older Black woman, older than me. When I said that in the context of a meeting, she got very upset with me. She got really upset. And she said, what do you mean it's an illusion? It's real. It's as real as anything else. And I got with her after the Zoom call and we had a conversation. She was crying by the end of it, because that feeling of the ways in which you have struggled in your life to try to prove your worth, and always as a Black woman, you get the pushback. And for her, that niggling doubt, like maybe they're right, like because I haven't achieved X or Y or Z, or it's maybe they're right, I'm inferior. And it's of course irrational. That's also irrational, because that's not based in reality. Look at your situation. We all are human and make human errors, but in the totality of the situation, yeah, choices, let's talk about that. Capacities, let's talk about that. So it is, I know people have said to me, you know, how can you say that? But I just completely believe it. And it's been a guide for my entire life. I'm never intimidated by white folks, ever, ever. And I've had to consort with, you know, all those demigods and people living in the rarefied realms of medicine and law, people who really do think they are gods. And it's a fascinating thing to me to watch what happens when you actually don't believe in white supremacy around them. They can smell you. They can feel that you just don't have the right attitude towards my authority. And I enjoy that very much, a lot.
Yeah, I think to go back to your earlier point, because I think that you mentioned something. So there was like this thread about multiple definitions of liberation. And then I think that you started to say something to me that I like wanted to respond to, but it was essentially about like how we produce, I guess like how we produce some type of commonality across difference, or like how do we get to a space where we can like, and so I just wanted to say that like, okay, this has been something that has sat with me for a long time, the same way that like your dad talked to you, my parents talked to me the same way. And I think that, you know, I have, and also I just want to add something, which is like in my family, there's this really, everybody has the same idea, which is that you stay, one of them, I think I might've mentioned this last time, is that you stay until the work is done, right? So like, no matter what, you stay until the work is done. And I've taken that. But the other one is that someone has to be in the room. And even if you're the only person in the room, at least you can move something forward because you're the only one in the room. And that's the part that I don't believe in.
And when you say
and that's like what, yeah.
How do you interpret that?
You know, it's fascinating because I'm from, you know, a really beautiful, like vast community. Like my family is huge, right? Like, so there's a lot of different kinds of people in my family. And so how I've interpreted that is like, a lot of people that work in corporate spaces, a lot of people that have been organizers, a lot of people that have been in the church, a lot of people that have done, organizing work on varying scales, like, across stratas of society or whatever. So how I interpreted that, especially like me being a young person, was like, oh, okay, so like I have to essentially put myself in these spaces in order to like do something. And that was the part that I couldn't believe. And that was the part that like didn't really sit well with me ever since I was a kid, was like this idea that like I had to be there to make something happen. And so when oh yeah, go ahead.
So wait a minute, when you're in that room, are you alone? Is it?
Well, that's the thing, is like you're the only one. So like if you're the only one, and that was the part that I didn't believe. And that was why, so when I say like I create spaces, or I intentionally pull myself or call myself, or like by osmosis find these spaces where I am not the only person in the room, or I am not the only person that's like-minded, or I try to find spaces where I know that like I can make difference, that can make ripples at the waves edges. I truly believe that. I have always struggled with that idea, and I know that that's something that is like a generational difference between me and my family. But it's something that that what you were saying earlier kind of like reminded me of, and like that's why I wanted to say it, was just like this idea that like we must, like this compulsion to like constantly be on defense in these spaces is like one that I don't have.
Right.
And that I really try hard to like, create the spaces that I wish that I had, or create the spaces that other people say that they wish that they had, in order to just not be on the defense all the time, in order to like actually be able to like create some softness in my life.
Yes, no, of course, because the thing is, naturally, of course, you need to have, otherwise we're dead. Without our little kinship groups and our friendship groups and whatever it is that brings you into, oh, wonderful, Ari's back.
Her power was turned off.
Oh, okay. Yes, that's not the only place you live. I don't know if that is the only place that you live, but I do know I created a pretty streamlined life for a while there. I was in Combahee. I was working for legal services for the people. I was, doing the Women in the Law conference. Everything that I did was surrounding parts of my identity that reinforced for me in really positive ways. I also knew what it was like to organize, and I made myself, for example, organize with the Carpenters Union, a bunch of white Irish guys from, wherever, where I was teaching them in a freedom school about their rights. It was when I was a lawyer, and teaching them, teaching them about their rights. And, when I first walked in the room, of course, they didn't really want to even talk to me. By the end of my time at Tufts teaching them, they were like crying and like, what do you mean you're leaving? And we tell everybody about you and you're the only one like you. Yeah, excellent. The thing is, I knew at least 5 of those guys, if I ever had to like call somebody for a gang activity, I could count on them. And I'm saying that jokingly, but I really want to say the thing about creating those relationships when you can, if you're capable of making those connections across very hard-looking lines, you learn things about human beings that you can't learn when you're around people who only, quote, think like you, close quote. And trust me, they don't all think like you, but like to say we do, because, that would appear to be,
And that's, and that's what I mean, is like finding those intimate, those smaller spaces of connection, rather than doing things constantly again on the larger scale, on the whole wide world scale, but rather the small worlding, the intimate connections that we can have in order to make change.
That's right. Well, and you're lucky. Don't forget, there's a privilege to being able to have that life. You don't have to be, you're not a domestic. You're not working in a factory.
I used to.
No, listen. And I can say, you're not doing that anymore, though, are you? I mean, that's the thing. Artists do have to do a lot of wacky things. So I'm not going to say you won't necessarily be a house cleaner again. But I think we have to honor and recognize that some of the choices that we're able to make as people who have lived either on the margin or carved out a space where we can live authentic lives. The concept is an interesting one because it is definitely not available to everyone. And we know this, and it's been demonstrated for us countless times as we've talked about and thought about transformation and liberation. So, yeah. Yes.
I wonder, and Ari, I hope we're able to hear you if you're in a place where you can get audio. But I wonder.
Yeah, no, I'm here.
Oh,
good,
fantastic. I'm curious. Okay, so being the white woman in the virtual room, you know, to get some frank takes on also the culture of conflict aversion. And, you know, having grown up in a Catholic household and going to 12 years of Catholic school where it's about you know, being harmonious and following the rules. You know, I've come to a lot of learning, and especially through this project, about conflict aversion being a scenario that, you know, it's avoiding contestation. And I also feel like avoiding that contestation, it's not just the fear of, like, say, you know, religion and Catholic Church of avoiding, but I do think it's also the fear of the idea of having a fair conversation or being on a level ground, and the fear of losing, right? And so it's interesting, you know, to think about learning to build up that strength, to build up that resiliency, to avoid all of those tears of white fragility, to be able to, as Demita, you're saying, like, you're in the cauldron, like you have to build the muscles to be able to swim, and you have to be able to also build up what I think you've talked about many different superpowers, but also one of humility.
Yeah.
You know, when the thing you couldn't see because it was the water that you were swimming in your whole life is something that is a problem, and you know, you're part of that ecosystem. And so I do feel like it's been interesting to rethink conflict from my perspective as something constructive, and not necessarily you know, oh, it's against the rules, it's ruining the system, or it's not professional, or it's not productive, because I can see that if the system isn't working, there aren't other avenues to shift it all the time, right? Like sometimes you actually need that space relationally. And so I'm curious again for Sierra and Ari and your, like, frank thoughts on that, if you wanted to talk about that. And I think I will just let you know, I think when your screen is not active, you're also not appearing on YouTube. So we don't see you we don't see your picture on the screen as well.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm just having a really bad day, and I'm not really in a state to be on camera right now. Which is why I have it turned off. Just like really hectic stuff came out of the blue. So, but they can hear my voice though, right?
Yes. Thank goodness.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Awesome. I mean, I honestly kind of don't even know where to begin with with that question. I think it's kind of really loaded. I will say, you know, I think both Sierra and I, and also Demita, are people who've all had to work in spaces where white fragility has really kind of been a barrier to us decolonizing the areas that we're in, being able to have frank conversations about that, about the white fragility that's going on, that's kind of keeping us from moving forward. And yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. It's definitely a muscle. And I think that you know, it's not comfortable to be uncomfortable, right? It's not comfortable to be confronted with all of the ways in which you may or may not be problematic, are participating in a system of oppression. But unfortunately, I think a lot of liberation is about being uncomfortable, you know? And yeah, I don't know. I'm just kind of rambling at this point.
No, you're not rambling.
You're making a ton of sense and articulating, I think, what has to be heard.
That's right. Wait, and there's something else too. I thought you were going towards this, Ari, but one of the things about so-called white fragility, which I think Robin DiAngelo coined that phrase.
Yeah.
But let me tell you, it was a pre-existing condition because I remember the first time that I had a white woman cry. We were in high school when I raised something about, you know, something racist that she said about Black people. And thank God I was a young Black girl from the South Side of Chicago. Because I said, why are you crying? Why are you crying? And she literally had to burst laughing because the truth was she got it. She'd been using tears her whole life to get out of stuff. And so for one, she had somebody push back. And I say that to say, when people use emotion to avoid conversation, it's just a way to try to reestablish control of the conversation. It causes a break. I learned this in therapy. It causes a sudden break that distracts from the core issue that's going on. And you have to be, and it's hard. And I think we have to practice this with one another as well as with difference issues, is to really lean into when we need to continue conversing. There are also moments when you need to step back because you can't talk in that moment. Learning how to be in conflict, generative conflict, I'm telling you, I love that so much. Learning how to be that is going to be an art for us because there's nothing in the dominant culture that supports the idea of generative conflict. It's just not. I mean, I suspect, and I think I know this is true, that this is something that's really been an interesting issue within the queer community. And I'll go back to this again. How do we, someone said to me not too long ago, so bisexuals are still unicorns, right? I said, yeah, pretty much. And she said, but I thought we were going to be over that by now. I said, yeah, some of the young people told me that was not even an issue anymore. But then somebody else wrote me a letter and said it's a huge issue. The truth of the matter is we are still treating one another, and I don't think this is uniformly true, but we are still having the forbidden in our midst. And we still continue. I had a conversation with a white gay man recently about this, about the fact that he still honestly can't reconcile himself to the idea that a man can be bisexual. He could see a woman being bisexual, but he just wanted to say, as far as he's concerned, any man that says he's a bisexual is just afraid of coming out. And it exhausted me. Just hearing him say that was exhausting. It's like, oh, okay. So we're still disappearing people. Good to know. Thank you so much. So again, and I thought that was generational. When I found out this other younger than me by 30 years, was saying the same thing, I was, okay, so we still have a lot of work to do to make the space open, to truly make space open in our own communities. And I don't know, does that resonate at all, Sierra, what I just described?
I think, yeah, no, I think this is, as Ari said, like a very difficult conversation to enter, not because it's about conflict, but just because it's so vast. I think that there are multiple ways, and as you know, Demita, you described, you gave us like a lovely overview of conflict earlier. But I think that, you know, when we're thinking about interpersonal and, you know, interpersonal versus like organizational violence, disappearing, you know, like the deliberate annihilation of like Black spaces and Black geographies through white supremacy as invoked, through people just being like, well, that's just my opinion, or that's just, you know, it's always just, you know, it's always just, right? Like when we think about the annihilation of those things through that, it's, well, it's my opinion, or it's just, right? Like that is still, I think Ari didn't say this exactly, but like, you know, to echo Ari's opinion in my own words, like that is still a form of violence. That is still something to be taken seriously. That is still, you know, something that people like really need to contend with. And like, you know, when we're, I think, you know, coming up against these structures, and I'm just speaking from my own experience here, because I actually don't remember the exact question, but speaking from my own experience, you know, when I'm thinking about the ways that I've come up against, the ways that I've come up against these structures in the effort to create like some sort of, you know, some liberatory something, some liberatory geography for myself and for others.
it's usually just the rules, or it's usually, you know, just how it is, or it's usually, and it's like, there's never actually a space of imagination where people feel like they can enter and configure something that's not what they're already seeing. And so like, this is why I mentioned the term geography. This is why I mentioned the term, like, this is why I think about, or like, am trying to think about architecture so often now, is because, you know, like, this is the scaffolding, as you said, the imagination is the scaffolding of our life. It's like, whether or not you can actually see something beyond the black and white that's on the paper, it's just right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so like, that's at least for me, like, that's always the difficulty. Like, I'm someone that, you know, did grow up with a lot of silence, did grow up with a lot of, not necessarily my immediate family, like my parents are amazing, and allowed me, you know, and my brothers and my sisters, my sister, the space to, you know, like, have conversations about things sometimes. But mostly, you know, in my wider family and in wider society, it's, as, you know, Jen stated it, it's like, this is how you fit in. This is these are the spaces of silence. This is what we need in order to do the work of discipline and punishment, in order to get you to be the productive member of society that we need you to be, to do the things, right? Like, in, you know, production again, right? Like, I went to a school with demerits. I've always been in schools with uniforms and demerits and punishment and, you know, things like that, right? And so I think, you know, again, yeah, no, it's serious, right? And so again, it's like this idea that, like, in order to be, you know, in order to be productive, in order to be of service, you know, you cannot produce anything that's outside of the prevailing knowledge systems.
Right.
And so like, how, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
And so
keep going.
yeah. No, and so like, what do we do, right? Like, what do we do is like, you know, we got to talk about it. We have to like truly confront it. And like, maybe, you know, the person isn't saying it the right way, or like they haven't exactly found the language, or maybe, you know, like that person also parked in your space. And so you're still mad at that bitch from last week. And, you know, like, it's, yes, it's all those things. And also like, you know, if someone really does have a point, or someone is truly grasping at something, a seed of something that could be generative, then we have to listen to it, and we can't just like, you know, foreclose the possibility that like they're just too much, or like it's just that's where I'll.
Oh, wonderful though.
Truly brilliant in this. I love the framing also, Sierra, when you were just saying, you know, what I was talking about is conflict aversion, or, you know, accepting of the policing of behavior, like Catholic school, the demerits, et cetera, also, and realizing, all right, then that's accepting a power structure as opposed to confronting it, or you use the beautiful word imagination. Like, how are we, if you are lacking the imagination, I had used the word curiosity earlier, but if you're lacking the imagination of how, that is actually hurtful to somebody else. If you're lacking the imagination, you know, what do we do constructively that stimulates that imagination to get somebody to actually see? And so, you know, I have found, you know, the readings and, you know, if it is through the literary work of a number of the Black feminist thinkers that you've collated into the virtual reading room, there are creatives who are sort of pointing to ways to imagine. And you've used also this word, like a space that is generative, which is why like the garden metaphor is actually so interesting. Why, like when you were talking about the garden metaphor, when Ari named her project, The Roots That Bind, like thinking about a place to cultivate and grow something new. I think what we need is that imagination, like just, it's not just empathy, but it's being able to imagine something so outside of that experience prior.
Yeah, and it's the imagination, and then it's also the doing, because I think this is also a conversation that we have in these spaces. I think, Demita, you probably heard this for like the past like 5 or 7 years. It's just like, oh, radical imagination. You know, Ari and I talk about, it's like, okay, like, yes, imagination, and also like the after, like the steps after, because I don't want us to get stuck in the place of like radical imagination, although like it is important and it's beautiful. It's also like, how do we get to a space where people feel like they can start to take the steps towards what they're imagining? How do we get to a place where people can start to raise money for the things that they're imagining? How do we get to the place where we can start to like
kind of act on some of these things, because as Demita said, you know, Demita has been around here and doesn't think that Black feminism took. So obviously, you know, it's not just about the writing, and it's not just about the reading, and it's not just about, no, you got to do it, you got to live it, you got to practice it.
Yeah, yeah.
So right. And can I just also say, I so everything about what you were just saying, both of you, brings us back to, we don't have processes, right? We don't have a mechanism. And I know it's so funny. I was in a meeting with a group of people who were at Makeshift, and I was talking about the need to, you know, as a Black feminist, democratic socialist, but also as someone who knows you got to get shit done. You got to have a system to get shit done. And people were just like, I don't want to do that. They're like bucking goats. They're like, no, I don't want to do that. You know, just like, let's let it flow. I'm like, that's not how shit works. You really do have to have structures. And it really is, not all rules are bad, and not all structure will kill you. The structures that we create that are generative out of ourselves, that are, and if we start talking about things like, what are meaningful representations of respect when you're in conflict?
Mm-hmm.
What do you do when we can do some problem sets. What do you do in your organization when people truly are not adhering to the ethos you all signed up for, or at least you said you did?
Mm-hmm.
How do we hold each other accountable in a meaningful way, not a bullshit way, but in a meaningful way that's not harsh, abusive, but that in fact comes from a place of recognizing, if it were you sitting there, how would you want to be treated?
Mm-hmm.
So, and I say that also, my friend said, don't forget the people who want to be abused. I'm like, okay, right, asterisks. So what? Yeah, well, Annie Lennox did write that song. Who am I to disagree? So I think it's really important to remember that as we talk about how to make these things actual, how to actualize them, we have to recognize that we've got to build into our organizations some, again, scaffolding, an ethos and regular practice. I'm like, people need to transfer a lot of that yoga energy to the organization development sphere. And, really recognize, because yoga teaches you cannot do the asanas without practicing. You must. Practice is required. And people resent practice because it means that you have to do sacrifice and you have to do things when you don't necessarily feel peak. But one of the things I loved about Combahee that we did do right, when we had 60 women in the room, we had an opening ritual every time to center people in that room for that conversation. And we didn't even really know that much about how to do that, but we had learned it in some other group setting. And it really helped people to get centered and focused on, this is our space to do with it what we choose. So learning the practice of generative conflict and developing what that could be, because we need structures. We don't come by this naturally. And also, I love the conversation when you start talking about the two of you who were from situations where, where there was rules and uniforms, and I'm laughing the whole time. I was raised by a pagan, and I've kicked out of both a rough little Southern Baptist Sunday school, and I was kicked out of catechism when I tried to become a Catholic. Father Elroy kicked me out. He told me I couldn't come back because I asked too many questions. And so that is, I hold those up as signs of honor, because that's, again, the need to delve deeply and to question, learning how to do that. As you're talking about this, I'm realizing it mitigates what your training, the doctrinal training you received all those years in Catholicism, mitigates against actual keeping it real, being present in the moment of conflict, valuing conflict. And the nice, look what niceness did for the Catholic Church. Yeah, so nice. Yeah, a lot of fakery. So it's not really, it makes no sense. So I'm going to stop again. And I have no idea what time is it. What time is it?
I was going to pivot over to Ari. I think you unmuted to jump in.
Oh, yeah. That was a while ago, but I kind of forgot what I was going to say now. But I think what you just brought up, Demita, about yoga and asana, it's funny because I am reading a book right now that's kind of talking about like decolonizing yoga spaces. And I think that's a really apt metaphor, how everyone kind of becomes obsessed with the look of the thing without the actual doing of the thing, right? So like the asana, the physical part of yoga, but not doing the spiritual part of yoga because it doesn't feel as gratifying to have to not only delve deep and recognize your own shortcomings, but to then extend grace to others. Like that doesn't come easy. And I feel like it's the same way with with the shit that we're talking about. Like it, again, it's uncomfortable for people to have to really attempt to do the internal work. And I think too, the important thing I feel like, especially in our communities, is recognizing that not everybody always has to be doing the imagining. Like, I feel like what we're doing right now with Mercedes from Pride Extended is kind of a good example of that, where Pride Extended is not something that we imagined. That is not something that we came up with. That is something that a sister in our community came up with, that she imagined. But it's how do we use our resources and our access to resources to support the imagination that's already taking place. You know what I mean? I feel like a lot of people always kind of want to do the imagining without also offering support to others who are already doing the work in their communities. And I feel like that's why a lot of times things don't get further, is because there's not that intracommunal like support of imagination. I don't know, but that's kind of, I think that's kind of what I was going to talk about, but I can't exactly remember.
That's okay.
Ari, I think it's such an important point to, I mean, just give a very specific shout out, because it relates directly to what Sierra was talking about before, as well as what you were just saying, that Mercedes Loving Manley not only has the imagination of how do we build celebration and do the work. How do we build not only visibility, but mutual aid for the Black trans community? And then how do we create an event like the Pride Extended Fest that is embracing all of the aspects of Mercedes, multidisciplinary and intersectional identity as a performer, a filmmaker, but also a curator, a community organizer, an advocate, and an activist together into a project that is at once artistic, but also effective and bringing action and support to her particular community. I mean, especially after Jaheria de Alto's murder, right? And so it's something that makes so much sense to then, just as you were saying, support with resources. When somebody has an idea, that's a resource. When somebody has space, that's a resource. When somebody has that's a resource. When somebody has vision, that's a resource. And coming together to make something happen that couldn't have happened possible, and in a way that honors people's labor, their time, their need. I think that's such a beautiful project. And I'll drop again in the chat like the link to Mercedes project.
I do want to say too, and I do want to bring this up in all transparency, that while it is great to be able to offer resources and access to resources and space and things like that, because of the nature of the project, we were able to do that the nonprofits in Boston and in Massachusetts in general have a long way to go in actually learning how to support the imagination of Black and Brown creatives, specifically Black, queer, and trans Black women here in Boston. There's a lot of decolonizing, and I keep using that word, but the way that we treat artists, especially artists with imagination, especially artists of color with imagination, is way too paternalistic. Especially the way that we do it through nonprofits and foundations. It's this constant state of having to prove that you either have a trauma, or they basically want some trauma porn, one, right? And then they need to approve your trauma porn too, right? And then they give you the money, but then they still need you to prove that you're using the money in the ways that they see fit as applicable to that grant or whatever it may be. And so I even working with nonprofits in Boston, across Massachusetts, across the country, the thing that I hear time and time again from Black and Brown organizers is that it's difficult, and that there are difficulties erected when there don't need to be difficulties, simply because a lot of times they assume that we don't know what we're talking about. They assume that we don't know how to spend the money. I mean, it's part of the nonprofit industrial complex where they don't see us as trustworthy, as being able to take money and use it effectively and effectively budget it and get a project done. They don't see us as being capable of doing that. And that's why there's a lot of paternalism. And so when you bring up Mercedes, you know, I do want to be very transparent in that there's a lot of stuff happening in the nonprofit scene here in Boston that is not okay. And, you know, that includes not paying your artists on time. You know, that includes having these crazy waits for artists to get paid. Like, you know, I'm not trying to call out Boston University, but their pay period goes up to 45 to 60 days for an artist to get paid. You know, so even if I want to pay someone for their labor, it still has to go through this white supremacist system that still ends up impacting them negatively anyway. So that's why I'm saying, you know, even though us as Black women, we want to help its support and provide space to other Black and Brown people, there are still these white supremacist systems that even hang us up in trying to do that. So I just want to be very explicit and clear with that, because I've been very frustrated. I know there have been other people in Boston who have been frustrated with just the landscape in general and how difficult it can be to just get shit done, you know? And that's just kind of the bottom line.
One comment, I'm sorry, I just want to step in and say, what's fascinating to me about what you said, Ari, is that the paternalism and the infantilizing and the refusal to accept equity are all flowing from the structural racism and white supremacy that is particularly potent in New England. When you look at the nonprofit industrial complex and you look at the evolution across the country, along with philanthropy, the further west you go, the less restrictions there are, the changes that are there. But Boston is unique. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, I've lived in 3 cities, and Boston is paternalistic, doesn't begin to express it. And the idea, by the way, I think probably when they first began talking about reparations for Black folks, way back in the 19th century, there's a lot of pushback from the abolitionists here in Boston. Because ironically, you know, giving these people money, which they're going to go drink up or throw away or gamble away, that's the same mentality that continues. So it has to do also, I think, that's one of the problems with capitalism. That's one of the issues that we have with the way capitalism functions, especially late stage capitalism. You have people still committed to the idea of 19th century patriarchal giving a la Carnegie. No, Carnegie was pretty good, but you know some of those others. And it's also really telling to me, even when organizations that, especially when organizations that are giving organizations like the Boston Fund are run by Black folks. And I love when people are like, but now it's run by a Black person. I'm like, yeah, so what's your point? Because, you know, you think someone radical is going to be elected to that position. In order to get to where that person is, they've had to jump through hoops you never even believed in. So it's not as if one person can make a traumatic shift in an organization, especially if it's a Black woman. I'm thinking about the Black woman who's the head of the Boston Foundation. So the entire schema is rife with ugliness and problems, and yet we're still beholden because we can't print our own money. And we also don't have, and even Black capitalists, maybe especially Black capitalists, can be particularly paternalizing towards Black people. I'm very, you know, I just struggle often with the entire idea of the way in which money and resources are shared. It's just, it's a conundrum. I have not figured it out. I really haven't. I feel like I know and have known some vastly wealthy people, and you don't know people until you start talking with them about their money.
Hmm.
And then you find out your radical friends are not so radical, that your friends, there's just so many issues that relate. Good people like George Pillsbury of the Pillsbury family, who helped us start the Haymarket Foundation, was on the original board, was one of the original contributors. Abby Rockefeller, again, from the Rockefellers, again, original person with the Haymarket Foundation. It's a radical communist-based organization and has persisted, but could never generate enough interest to get the kind of money where you could throw big money at people, like significant funding. We're always in our little local radical philanthropic groups and nonprofits, never going to have the clout, the capital to do what we would really want to do. So it's a tricky, the whole schema is problematic. It really is.
Well, the thing about it is that I think that what you're talking about, the radical shift that you're talking about, has to happen at a legal level. We're talking about wealth redistribution. We're not talking about somebody's little coin. We're not talking about somebody's $100, $200, $300, $400, $500,000.
That's
right. We're talking about wealth redistribution, which is honestly, and again, Demita, like what you're talking about is at the core of all of our issues.
Yes.
Right? Like when someone is waiting to get paid 40, 50, 60 days, as Ari said, it's not because, if they could wait, they would.
Yes.
It's because there is not an infrastructure of care in the United States to adequately support people who are artists, starving artists, working class people, which is actually what they are. Let's describe them in the true terms. It cannot support working class people.
Right.
And so when you are making someone wait 60 days, 70 days, 80 days, if you're a writer, Ari, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it'd be 3, 4, 5 months to get paid from some of these publications.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes, easily.
And so again, and so again, like what we're talking about is like deep structural change that like, yes, like, we can do our little 1-2 at this level, as Demita like has talked about and expressed, and we can, again, like there was this meme that was going around, is like me and my friends circulating the same $20 in our Venmos. Right? Like we can do that kind of work, and that's also important. And we can like, again, we can pool our money together and we can like go buy some land and maybe start like a community land trust or something. We can do that work, and that is important too. And I don't want to like stewarding in those ways is also important, and I don't want to make it seem like that's not important. However, what we're talking about is some deep structural transformation that until we can, again, like as you talked about, Demita, change the hearts and minds of people, to get them on board with some of those things, then we're going to be in this holding pattern. And until then, catch me trying to build the eco village for y'all, I guess.
And I can be the farmer gardener for you. Trust me. I have a permaculture certificate. Yeah. Can I also say, isn't this amazing how we always, as people who are committed to transformation and evolution, when we buck up against, one of the things that I realize is that we have to spend 50% of our time with radical interrogation and analysis, only 50%, because if we do not dream with the other 50%, we'll lose our minds, really. The systems that we're talking about are at such a vertically integrated level that when you think about trying to undo late stage capitalism, forget the headache, you're gonna have a stroke, because the nature and complexity of what we're dealing with is complicated. And also, I think one of the things that I believe about the dreaming 50% is that I think one of the things I've learned is that the ideas that birth themselves and that surface, you may not see a manifestation of what they're capable of doing even in your own lifetime.
Yeah.
Really, the lesson, I joke when I say Black feminism didn't take, because what I would have liked to have seen was the elimination of all roles, androgyny for everybody, or whatever people want, but nobody has to be in beef about it, and that we have total equality. And that was what I'd hoped. And I knew it wasn't going to happen, because I learned through reading history and watching humans, you need more people committed to that vision. And if people don't want Black women, if Black women don't even struggle for our own liberation on a regular, it's really going to be problematic to ask others to support us. So it's the issues that relate to all the barriers that keep us from dreaming. We can only look at that for part of the time. We have to really devote so much of our time when we can to structured dreaming, to really thinking. And actually, I find the one thing about these conversations that's been so great is it's made me go back and look at, like, why are we still now with tensions between gay men and lesbian women and trans people in our little tiny organizations, in our tiny world, because we make up a very small slice of the actual earth. So the lesson that we haven't learned yet is that we are few and we need one another, don't we? Don't we? Do we? I think that may be the question. When I go to, Chicago is renaming Boys Town, okay? Because they found it to be too, well, I understand why it's called Boys Town. I was one of the acolytes and one of the denizens of Boys Town when it became Boys Town. I mean, I understand why it happened. That's what happens with ghettoization. It becomes our town, where we are that are in the ghetto. But the reality also is it preserved and continued to strengthen divides between us. So now, instead of dealing with the divides, they're renaming Boys Town to make it more inclusive. But Chicago lesbian and gay and LGBTQIA politics in Chicago is still a jumble. It's still fractured. It's still conflicted, and not in a good way. So, 50 years later, here we are. I just feel like I'm never going to lose hope, because I can't. I just won't. I'm never going to not be a happy-go-lucky person, because that's also who I am. So, despite the harshness, the difficulty, I'm never going to not be joyful, which means I'm never going to not be a troublemaker. And I think not everybody wants to be that, and there has to be space for every kind of possibility, but I'm always still looking, and I probably will be looking until I'm really old, for real, like my grandmother at 99, for those troublemaking people, because artists, musicians, thinkers, the troublemakers, we need to always support everybody, and especially people who are trying to bring fresh water to us and fresh ideas.
Well, I love the idea of
Go ahead.
I like the idea of ending on that note of troublemakers, maybe shouting out in our last few minutes together as the close of the project, those who support that dreaming, who, maintain that confrontational joy, but also, who are taking the steps, doing the work, taking the action to cause the trouble. And, we, of course, want to give you a last word, Demita, if you want, on that front of things. I mean, those causing trouble that make you hopeful, or those ideas or those dreams that, you want to leave us with.
I guess the only thing I'm going to say truthfully is being persistent and learning how to manage your strength so that you can be persistent in the long term. But I also want to say, leave space in your life. Right now, we're activists and engaging all sorts of people with the work of freedom. And life will teach you as you go along where you should go. You're going to get many different messages about what your next mission is, if you will. Be open to that, because where it takes you, I love what you said, Sarah, about people saying you had to stay in the room. I don't think you have to stay in the room. I think you may have to stay as long as required before you go on to your next work, because I don't believe in that kind of suffering. If you're in the room alone, you don't belong there. You need to be in a crowded room with many people, not just you alone, waging, the single war. So I just want to say, here's to interconnectivity and interdependence and making those connections lasting.
Thank you, Demita. That was so beautiful, and I agree, because I don't plan to suffer. So, I guess we can do like the little gratitude practice roundup. Jen, do you want to?
Yeah.
Did you have anything that you wanted to start with, or?
I do. I want to acknowledge and in a way, of course, thank you to those who supported this effort. Demita, thank you for answering the email and picking up the phone and joining the call so long ago in 2019 about this. But I guess I would want to give a shout out to, I feel, an important person and an important group that like enacts a collective action today, and also is in a position of having supported literally collective imagination, spatial justice in Boston. And that's Kamaria Carrington at NEFA, but also the member of the larger collective Unbound Bodies. I just feel like in Boston, that's somebody everybody should know about, that the work of that group, and in particular, their project supported by Design Studio for Social Intervention, Kenny Bailey, Laurie Lobenstein, Aya, now Crystal, in terms of in public projects and taking up space in beautiful ways. And I really feel like that's to me an example that like I want to continue to look to and look to colleagues on that front who are doing great work like that. Sierra, I'll toss it to you in terms of those you want to shout out.
Yeah, I mean, I guess first, for this project, this is like our last program, or this is our last program with the curators. We will be at the Pride Extended, the close of the Pride Extended Fest on July 9th. But I do want to like shout out some of the people that have been part of this project. So first, from our colleagues at the BCA, Andrew, Jean, who did a lot of our design. Thank you all so much for hanging in there with us. Jean and Andrew like did a ton of work on our behalf. So just wanted to like shout them out and say that like public thank you for all the work that y'all put in to help us with this, because it was a struggle and a journey. But we're at the end of our year and we're here and we did it. Also, Ms. Suka Berry, who did the window installation at the Mills Gallery, Ariel Gray, and Zoe Pulley, who did the thematically curated, call and response project and the free zine that we gave out at the BCA Plaza, which I think is like still available.
It is.
So y'all should definitely try to go get one before this is over. Everyone that contributed to the virtual reading room, Jen, Demita, you were there in spirit because we do have the Combahee River Collective paper, and Ari for helping out, as well as Mercedes Loving Manley, who is producing Pride Extended. Oh my God, is there anything else? Is there anyone else? Oh, colleagues, yeah. I mean, first of all, an easy one is obviously Ariel and you, Jen. For sticking through this and like us doing it, and like Demita for being like the guiding light, in this project. I'd also like to say, yeah, I mean, Kamaria and Unbound Bodies are amazing. Bashizo is an amazing human being, and Kamaria is an amazing human being, and I'm super lucky to be in community with both of them. I would also say, my colleagues at Ujima and at the Create Well Fund, who have like helped shape me over the last like 4 or 5 years into dreaming the way that I dream today. I'm like, who else? I'm like, there's so many people, it's hard to, I wish that we would have thought about this before. I would have like said something a lot more pithy. I would have.
No, I love also that you work with organizations with such significant names, Ujima, as well as Create Well. And I'll just echo your thanks. Randy, also Lindsay, Emily, the leadership as well, all of the colleagues at BCA for the trust and the support and the working with us as we navigated a pandemic and altered a project and altered perspective and still contributed something citywide and as public in as many forms as we could, in print, street front, virtual space, live space. And it's just really, really been a privilege to work with you, Sierra, to work with Ari and Demita, to work with you. So thank you for setting the example and for reminding us to pace ourselves, because this is going to be a lifelong marathon. But it's just a pleasure to at least have people who are running along your side.
That's right. And thank you all. I'm grateful to all of you. And I also want to say, thank you so much for continuing, because I'm so glad that line about you being the people that we've been waiting for, yes, that's who you are. And I really am I'm filled with gratitude for having the chance to do this. Struggle long, struggle beautifully.
That's a perfect space to end.
Yeah. And thank you for everybody that joined us today. This is our final conversation until July 9th. We will be co-hosting Pride Extended. You can go to, is it BCA Online or, I'm sorry, bostonarts.org for more information.
Yes. Yep. Wonderful.
I think that's it. I think we can all say bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.